Australia is at a crossroads. With its thumping majority, the Labor government has an opportunity to deliver generational reform. At the Australia Institute, we'll keep fighting to make big gas pay, to build a fairer tax system, and to make the truth matter again. But we can't do it without your support. By making a tax-deductible donation today to our end of financial year appeal, you'll help fund research changing Australia for the better. You can give now by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes.
For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? Well, in this series, I'm speaking to some of Australia's and the world's best thinkers about how to make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and this is What's the Big Idea?, brought to you by the Australia Institute. In this episode, I'm speaking to Kieran Pender, the Associate Legal Director at the Human Rights Law Centre, where he leads the Whistleblower Project, Australia's first specialist legal service for whistleblowers. Kieran, as you may know, writes for The Guardian and is also Honorary Senior Lecturer at the Australian National University. Hello, Kieran. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Paul. How you doing?
Very well. So, whistleblowers are those who blow the whistle on corruption and wrongdoing in the workplace. Some recent examples people might be aware of are robo-debt, war crimes in Afghanistan, price gouging by supermarkets, just to name a few. Whistleblowers do us all a favour by calling out abuses of power and wrongdoing, and they do so often at significant personal cost. What are some of the risks that they face when they choose to speak out?
As you say, Paul, blowing the whistle makes Australia a better place. When we have transparency, we have accountability, ultimately we have justice. Unfortunately, the risks in speaking up remain far too high. Those risks really fall into three categories. The most serious risk is criminal risk. So right now, Dave McBride is in jail, not all that far from where I am in Canberra, as a result of his actions leaking to the ABC documents that form the basis of the Afghan files reporting, which provided credible evidence of war crimes committed in Afghanistan. We've got another whistleblower, Richard Boyle, who exposed wrongdoing at the tax office. He's going to face trial this year, faces over 20 charges, could similarly receive a custodial sentence if he's convicted. He's pleaded not guilty. So the worst case scenario is you go to jail for your truth telling. We've seen some high profile examples of whistleblowers being sued by their employers in the private sector when they've blown the whistle. There was a case involving Troy Stoltz, who blew the whistle on Clubs New South Wales member clubs' failure to comply with anti-money laundering laws. He blew the whistle to Andrew Wilkie MP and to some journalists and was sued for doing that. That case ultimately settled. But by far the most common scenario is that people who speak up about wrongdoing at work suffer backlash at work. We have cases where whistleblowers are sacked for speaking up, suffer other forms of detriment, demoted, suspended, bullied, and so on. And so while we've got these high-profile cases in the media, unfortunately, we know that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's research that shows that as many as 7 or 8 in 10 whistleblowers suffer some form of retaliation, whether formal or informal, which then has a real chilling effect on people speaking up. And so I guess the big policy question for us is, well, how do we better protect whistleblowers so that they don't have to face these risks? Because as you said, Paul, when people blow the whistle, we all benefit from the information that comes to light.
All of which is to say you need a significant amount of courage to actually speak out about wrongdoing in the workplace because of the lack of protections.
Indeed, we published a report in 2023 where we surveyed the failures really of Australia's whistleblowing laws, and we called that report the cost of courage, because unfortunately for too many people that cost is far too high. And that's something we really need to fix. Something I often reflect on is how any of us could be in a situation where we need to decide whether we're going to become a whistleblower. Any of us could go into our workplace tomorrow and see something wrong, whatever that wrongdoing is, maladministration, corruption, human rights abuse, environmental degradation, a whole spectrum of conduct that might fall within whistleblowing laws where there's a public interest in knowing about what is happening. And that would then leave any of us with this dilemma of, well, knowing those risks, do we speak up? And a big part of my work is trying to lower that cost of courage and ensure that the laws and institutions involved are improved. And that means that ultimately whistleblowers won't have to suffer the same risk in raising concerns, because we'll all be better off as a result. I mean, I often reflect on some of those high-profile cases that have then had really significant practical effect for all of us. Famously, the Banking Royal Commission was sparked by some very courageous whistleblowers. Every Australian with a bank account is better off because those whistleblowers spoke up, but I know that they endured significant personal costs. Or I think of robo-debt. There were, as the Robo-Debt Royal Commission makes clear, a number of people who, at the very beginning of robo-debt, public servants who said to their supervisors, this is unlawful, this is unethical, we shouldn't do this. Imagine that the cost in human lives, tragically, in untold misery, and in financial terms, billions of dollars wasted because the robo-debt scheme was pursued. And so I often reflect on, well, if courage wasn't so costly, maybe we'd be able to nip more of these things in the bud, and we wouldn't have to have robo-debt royal commissions and banking royal commissions, because we'd have the public sector agencies and the banks and other big corporations doing the right thing.
As a journalist, I have been in the past a recipient of information provided by whistleblowers. Just remind me, though, of the protections that do currently exist, as limited as they may be, for whistleblowers in Australia.
So most Australians in a workplace context, whether they're an employee, whether they're a contractor or so on, have some form of dedicated whistleblower protections. So at a federal, state and territory level, there are dedicated laws in all of those jurisdictions for public sector whistleblowers. We also have laws for private sector whistleblowers, and we have a few sector-specific laws in the NDIS context, in the aged care context, in the union context, and so on. On paper, those laws say if you speak up about wrongdoing, you're protected, and that protection takes two forms. You're immune from liability for speaking up. You can't be sued, you can't be prosecuted, you can't face administrative retribution. And then if someone does sack you for blowing the whistle, demote you for blowing the whistle, you can seek compensation, you can seek reinstatement, and so on. So on paper, those laws are reasonable, but what we found is in practice, they're not working. Australia once led the world in whistleblower protection. Australia became only the second country after the United States to enact whistleblowing laws. Our first laws in the early 1990s in Queensland in response to the Fitzgerald inquiry into police and political misconduct in Queensland. But unfortunately, in the subsequent decades, we've fallen behind, and we're now in this position where the laws, although good on paper, haven't translated into practical rights that people can access. And that means that people don't blow the whistle, or they do blow the whistle and they suffer immensely. The tax whistleblower Richard Boyle is a really tragic example. Someone who blew the whistle on wrongdoing, ultimately has been vindicated for that whistleblowing, is now being prosecuted. He sought to rely on a defence under whistleblowing law. So he said he was blowing the whistle, he should be immune from prosecution. But he's being prosecuted for the things he did in the lead up to his internal whistleblowing. And the court said the whistleblower protection only applies to the actual act of whistleblowing, not the things he did prior to whistleblowing for the purpose, he says, of whistleblowing. So a very narrow and technical construction that leaves him facing prosecution and really all Australian potential whistleblowers worse off.
He faces a criminal trial later this year, I understand, and as you say, the courts have rejected his case for immunity. So the courts are are forced, because of the absence of laws protecting whistleblowers, to take a narrow definition of what his rights are as a whistleblower, are they? And if we had better laws, the courts would be more able to allow that information to be brought forward.
Exactly. So that's one example where the laws have failed, and courts have given them very limited constructions. He argued that a broader approach was available on the law that exists. The court rejected that. He sought leave to appeal to the High Court, and the High Court declined to hear his case. So that is one example. The government, the federal government right now, in response, has said it's looking into that particular aspect of the law, the extent to which it applies more broadly as part of law reform efforts. But really, that example is one of dozens that I could give where the law looks good on paper, hasn't translated well in practice.
Yeah. In 2023, there were some reforms to the laws, to the public interest disclosure laws. They were enacted by the Albanese government in response to an election commitment. What were those reforms? How much have they improved the situation for whistleblowers, and how much further is there to go?
In a word, or in two words, not enough, and a very long way. The government committed to overhauling the federal public sector whistleblowing law. So it's called the PID Act, the Public Interest Disclosure Act. If you're an APS employee, if you're a federal government contractor, you're protected under these laws. Those laws were introduced in 2013. They had proven to not be working, and the government said it would fix them. It rushed through some initial minor and technical changes to coincide with the National Anti-Corruption Commission commencing. And then it said it would do a much broader overhaul, and it's consulted on that. And now we don't know where that's up to. The consultation paper came out in November 2023. There hasn't been any update. It is now seemingly impossible for any changes to be enacted by the end of this current term of Parliament. So that's been pushed into the next term of Parliament. Separately, we have a review of our private sector whistleblowing regime that's recently started. That's being undertaken by Treasury. So those two reviews in parallel will, I think, underscore the need for substantial reform. Unfortunately, one of the problems we have is the current overlap and inconsistency and fragmentation of our whistleblowing law. So right now, at a federal level, we have 9 different whistleblowing laws, as I mentioned, aged care, NDIS, unions, and so on. And many of those are slightly different. And so what we're seeing, unfortunately, in recent years under this government has been the continued fragmentation of the law. In response to the PwC scandal, we saw some better protections for tax whistleblowers. In response to the Aged Care Royal Commission, better protection for aged care whistleblowers. But all of this fragmentation just makes the overall landscape worse because you have people who are protected under inconsistent and different regimes, and some people protected under none of these regimes. So what we really need is holistic, comprehensive reform. And unfortunately, as yet, we haven't seen any sign from this government or the opposition that they're ready to tackle that really critical task.
Would it have made sense to have incorporated greater whistleblower protection into the new National Anti-Corruption Commission?
One of the things that we think is the missing piece of the puzzle, indeed, very much the big idea here, is establishing a whistleblower protection authority. And such an idea was part of the crossbench proposal for a National Anti-Corruption Commission. It was in the bill for a federal ICAC, as it was then called, that was introduced by Cathy McGowan MP. It was then in the bill that was introduced by the Greens, by Helen Haynes, this idea that in addition to establishing the National Anti-Corruption Commission, you're also establishing a whistleblower protection authority. Despite the federal government pledging to effectively mirror what the crossbench had proposed, such a body was not in what has ultimately become the National Anti-Corruption Commission. And that body is therefore weaker as a result. It's not the NAC's job to protect people who bring in information, but it can't do its job if people don't bring in information and not empowered and protected in doing so. And so that's one of many reasons why it's so important we, in addition to having the laws, have the infrastructure around it for those laws to work. And unfortunately, in the case of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, there was a missed opportunity as part of that body being established to also set up a whistleblower protection authority.
To what extent, then, are these insufficient protections for whistleblowers acting as a deterrent to speaking out against wrongdoing in the workplace? You have a unit there where you're working, where you deal with whistleblowers regularly. Are you getting a sense as to how difficult it is, the price that's paid by whistleblowers, and therefore a sense of why many would choose not to come forward even when they are witnessing wrongdoing?
Every day. So in August 2023, the Human Rights Law Centre established the Whistleblower Project, a specialist legal service, Australia's first dedicated legal service to help whistleblowers. We set that up in response to this clear policy failure. There was no accessible support for people who wanted to blow the whistle. Since we launched almost 18 months ago, we've been approached by over 300 people wanting our assistance. We've advised over 100 whistleblowers. And every day we see the practical challenges of navigating these frameworks. We see people who are stuck in black holes where they're not protected, or they can't do the thing that is an obvious way to raise concerns because it might be unlawful, or they may expose themselves to risk of being sued or being fired. That has a real chilling effect. I in the media, in relation to some of these high-profile prosecutions, have often used that term chilling effect. It's an easy term to use, but I use it because I see week in, week out, clients coming to me and saying, I'm afraid of blowing the whistle. I'm worried about going to jail because I see these high-profile cases. It doesn't need to be that way. If we had better laws, better institutions, if we had a whistleblower protection authority, and if the government and our Director of Public Prosecution stopped prosecuting whistleblowers, then whistleblowers would be in a much better position to do their job, their democratic role, speak up, expose wrongdoing, and all of us benefit as a result.
I'm Paul Barclay. I'm talking with Kieran Pender, Associate Legal Director at the Human Rights Law Centre, where he leads the Whistleblower Project. Kieran's written about truth, transparency and whistleblowing in the book, What's the Big Idea?, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute, which you can buy now. The book also features chapters by Yanis Varoufakis, Jennifer Robinson, Lucy Turnbull, Richard Dennis, and many, many other leading thinkers. And What's the Big Idea is available online from the Australia Institute website. When I think about whistleblower protection, Kieran, I think of the Fitzgerald inquiry in Queensland almost 40 years ago, which uncovered astonishing levels of corruption and misconduct at the highest levels of the police force, at the government, and an inquiry that could not have taken place without whistleblowers. The inquiry's report led to dramatic improvements in accountability and transparency in that state's democracy. The legacy of that report is immense to this day. And I reflect on that and think to myself, here we are in 2025 having this discussion about the need for greater whistleblower protection. Why have governments been so reluctant, at a federal level especially, which is really what we're talking about here, to enact satisfactory protection for whistleblowers?
I think that's a really important question, Paul, and it's certainly not for an absence of any public support. We've done polling at the Human Rights Law Centre, including with our partners at the Australia Institute, that demonstrates overwhelming public support for stronger whistleblower protections and for the establishment of a whistleblower protection authority. 70-80% of Australians appreciate the role of whistleblowers and think we need to do a better job. I think that reference to history is really important. When I was writing my chapter in this book, I looked back at the history. As I mentioned earlier, the Fitzgerald inquiry sparked what became Australia's first whistleblowing law in Queensland at the beginning of the 1990s. I was very honoured that Tony Fitzgerald, KC, the honourable former judge and famously commissioner of that inquiry, agreed to formally launch our whistleblower project when we launched it. But was looking back at that history, and it seems to me that at every time we have a major series of scandals, we have this resort for better whistleblower protections. And sometimes you get a little bit, but we just never quite go far enough and do what's needed to be done. And the Fitzgerald inquiry, we then had a few other scandals at a national level. And then in the early 1990s, we had a parliamentary committee into whistleblowing. This is at a time there were no federal whistleblowing laws. And the committee said, look, we need whistleblowing laws and we need a whistleblower protection authority. And eventually we got the laws, but we never got the authority. And then in the mid-2010s, we have the Banking Royal Commission. We have all of these corporate scandals. And Labor coming into the 2019 election off the back of a bipartisan parliamentary committee that said we need all this whistleblowing reform. Labor went to the 2019 election and said we need better whistleblowing laws. We need a whistleblower protection authority. We all know what happened at that election. And then again, just in response to the PwC inquiry, we've had a parliamentary report calling for better laws and a whistleblower protection authority in response to some of these other big scandals of late, robo-debt, war crimes in Afghanistan, the Aged Care Royal Commission, the Disability Royal Commission. Every time there's a crisis of accountability, we call for and we see calls for stronger whistleblower protections. But for so long, that missing piece of the puzzle just hasn't yet transpired. And that's why we really need political will coming into this next term of government. Whatever happens at the election, it's so critical that this is something that's acted upon. And, just when I was writing this chapter, because it coincided with the 30th anniversary of the Australia Institute, I thought it was sort of somewhat apt and ironic that 30 years ago, in 1994, we'd had this parliamentary review and it had said, create laws, but then create infrastructure, create enforcement, create support around those laws. And we've done that in all sorts of other areas. If you're underpaid at work, you can go to the Fair Work Ombudsman. If you're discriminated against at work, you can go to the Human Rights Commission. If you want to blow the whistle, where do you turn? We still haven't answered that question. And that's why 30 years on, 31 years on now, that is so overdue.
A lot of the current high-profile cases, some of which you've mentioned, David McBride, who was sentenced to prison for leaking documents pertaining to the so-called Afghan files to the ABC, Witness K and his lawyer, or their lawyer, Bernard Collaery. It's part of the wrongdoing by the Australian government against East Timor, or the allegedly unethical, immoral behaviour by the government. These are all public sector workers. To what extent do the laws and protections differ between the public and private sector in Australia, and to what extent does the reform need to be across both the public and private sectors?
It's critical that we have holistic and comprehensive reform, and a siloing reform to public and private sector won't achieve good outcomes. In part, that's because in the 21st century, the modern regulatory state is really a blend of public and private sector. And we see so many cases where it's private sector wrongdoing in relation to areas of government control or oversight. The PwC scandal perhaps being a good example of late. Unfortunately, at the moment, and part of this just because of the way government works, we get trapped in these silos. So right now, the Attorney General's Department at a federal level is reviewing public sector whistleblowing law, and part of that is whether we need a whistleblower protection authority, but only in relation to the public sector. Separately, Treasury is looking at the private sector, presumably will also look at the same question, but only in relation to the private sector. And so there's a real risk we're going to get two answers saying, in these particular silos, we don't need this, even though if you look at it at a total level, you'd say, look, the need is clear and it needs to be holistic and cross-cutting. I've often acted for whistleblowers who are government contractors, employees of government contractors or service providers, and they're often in a really invidious position because the protections under public sector and private sector law are complicated, the intersection of those. In this day and age, breaking it down and suggesting there's a clear delineation between public and private isn't really a workable regime. But I do think it underscores how problematic the current situation is. Private sector whistleblowers in Australia have significantly better protections right now than public sector because our public sector laws are from 2013, private sector laws are from 2019. So it's 6 years difference. The laws for public sector whistleblowers are significantly weaker, and the democratic imperative for our public servants to be protected in speaking up is so clear and compelling. So that's one of many reasons why this reform is so necessary and overdue.
You're advocating a whistleblower protection authority, as you mentioned earlier. Would it have an investigative function, that authority? Would it have a mechanism for addressing the specific whistleblower claim? Just give us a broad sense of how that authority would operate.
Certainly. So a whistleblower protection authority would oversee and enforce all of the different federal laws that protect whistleblowers. It would be a source of support and guidance, so people could come to it, bring in information. It would be an open door which could then coordinate with relevant agencies. So at the moment, it's often hard to know where to take information of wrongdoing to. So it would have that coordinative function. It would have that support function. It would be able to facilitate schemes for whistleblowers to be able to access legal support and other forms of support, including psychological support. It would then investigate mistreatment of whistleblowers. So if whistleblowers suffer, that's unlawful, but at the moment it's rare that you have regulatory bodies looking into that. It would have a dedicated function to oversee and to enforce those laws that protect whistleblowers and work with other investigative agencies to ensure that when whistleblowers bring them information, they're doing the best job they can. So it wouldn't look into the underlying wrongdoing. We have lots of regulatory agencies that investigate wrongdoing per se. It would facilitate, it would support. As I said, I think it would make the life of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, the life of our securities regulator, ASIC, the life of the Commonwealth Ombudsman much easier, and by taking some of that work away from them in a specialised way. But then also it would be a portal for people to come to, bring information, and then ultimately, facilitate this scheme, make sure it's working. That's not a novel idea. As I said, was first proposed in Australia 31 years ago. We've seen similar bodies in other countries, in the United States, in the Netherlands, in Slovakia, in the Maldives. Just last year, Spain established one. We've seen moves towards such bodies in the UK, in Ireland, one's underway, in Finland. So this is not novel. It's fast becoming international best practice, and Australia risks being left behind, and our whistleblowers will suffer as a result, and then ultimately all of us will suffer as a result because information about wrongdoing is not coming to public attention.
In some government agencies and departments, defence and security, for example, there's classified information that we're told the public shouldn't know about, as it may compromise our national interests or fall into the hands of our enemies. Would we need limits on whistleblower protection to ensure that sensitive and confidential information is not made public by whistleblowers?
Certainly. No one's suggesting that spies at ASIO should be able to go to the media tomorrow to bring information to light. The question is about striking the right balance. At the moment, most of our laws do provide that sort of calibrated approach. So they say that initially you're supposed to report internally or to a regulator, and then if things aren't addressed or if it's a real emergency situation, you're able to go, for example, to a journalist or to a member of parliament in a lawful and protected way. At the moment, though, people in the national security context and the intelligence context are carved out from any external disclosure pathways. They can only report internally or to the Inspector General for Intelligence and Security. And what we're concerned about, and concerns we've raised in the past, is it doesn't allow any safety valve for when things go wrong. So in other contexts, we recognise, look, sometimes, notwithstanding the best efforts of people internally and at an oversight level, you need public accountability. And we see, the importance of the Afghan files. We see the importance of the Kaleri and Witness K revelations about Australia's conduct. One of the reasons why Bernard Kaleri and his client, Witness K, who allegedly helped expose Australia's really immoral wrongdoing against our neighbours, Timor-Leste, they were never able to argue a whistleblowing defence because if you're blowing the whistle on intelligence wrongdoing, there's no lawful avenue to go public. And I think those two cases demonstrate that, look, sometimes actually you need to assess the information on its merits. And again, I'm not saying that tomorrow people at ASIO should be able to do what they please. It's obviously very important. There is a huge public interest in national security information being secure. But we need checks and balances that if things go seriously wrong, as they did in Afghanistan, as they did in Timor-Leste, sometimes you need that ultimate public accountability. In some other countries, they have a public interest defence of last resort to a criminal case. So you can say, look, I accept that I didn't fall within any of these protections, but ultimately it was in the public interest. I don't think anyone could say that The Afghan Files revelations, the Kaleri K revelations weren't ultimately in the public interest, but we need to change the law to ensure that we can better calibrate that balance.
In this series that I'm doing for the Australia Institute, we're being reminded that there are solutions to the big challenges that we face. In this case, whistleblower protection. We just need the courage to move forward. You've already pointed out public opinion polling done by the Australia Institute suggests there's a great deal of support for this and a great belief on the part of the public too that governments are too secretive when it comes with how they deal with corruption. So I suppose the question is, how do we take that next step to ensure this whistleblower protection goes ahead? I think you've got the Attorney General being open to a second tranche of reforms in this area. You've certainly got pressure from the crossbench. How do we push it forward though?
So the crossbench, particularly Dr. Helen Haynes MP, Andrew Wilkie MP, a former whistleblower himself, Senator David Pocock and Senator Jackie Lambie have been working on a private members bill to establish a whistleblower protection authority. I suspect that will have a lot of impetus and coming into the next parliament as well. We need two things. We need comprehensive law reform and we need a whistleblower protection authority set up with adequate independence and resourcing. Neither of those are that difficult. We're not reinventing the wheel. We have international best practice to rely on. It is not as if a whistleblower protection agency is going to cost the earth either. It is something that is eminently achievable, has been done in other jurisdictions. We're seeing momentum at a state and territory level, reviews of whistleblowing laws in Queensland, changes in New South Wales, the establishment of support in the New South Wales Ombudsman. So the federal government risks being left behind if it doesn't act. So what we need is, as you say, Paul, courage from whoever wins the forthcoming election to prioritise this comprehensive, accessible reform, and then the institutions that will act to support and empower whistleblowers. And hopefully then we don't have to have the next David McBride, the next Bernard Collaery, Witness K, Richard Boyle, Troy Stoltz, any of the other high-profile whistleblowers. As I said, sadly, those cases are just the tip of the iceberg. But with law reform, with institutional change, we can unlock this big idea and we can ensure that whistleblowers in Australia are ultimately protected, not punished. That will be in public service for all of us.
Yes, whistleblower protection, an idea whose time has come. Kieran, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks, Paul. A pleasure.
Kieran Pender is Associate Legal Director at the Human Rights Law Centre, where he leads the Whistleblower Project. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. Sign up to our mailing list to get involved, and if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure that we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer Australia. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Australia is at a crossroads. With its thumping majority, the Labor government has an opportunity to deliver generational reform. At the Australia Institute, we'll keep fighting to make big gas pay, to build a fairer tax system, and to make the truth matter again. But we can't do it without your support. By making a tax-deductible donation today to our end of financial year appeal, you'll help fund research changing Australia for the better. You can give now by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes.